Getting started with Dataverse from a SharePoint perspective. So what we're going to do today is we're going to unpack Dataverse. We're going to talk about environments and tables and different column types. And as we do it, we're going to kind of compare it to what its equivalent is in SharePoint to help you better bridge the gap. We're also going to talk a little bit about why you want to use Dataverse, how it does have some licensing, but just make sure that this data source that is key to being good at the Power Platform is front and center for you. Sounding fun? Then let's switch over to my desktop and take a look. Okay, so we started at the base of PowerApps. For me, that's make.powerapps.com. And so the first thing we understand when it comes to Dataverse is that you first have to understand this thing, environments, right? Over here on the top right, you've probably seen this before. If you click environments, what these are the different Dataverse, bubbles that you can go and build in. But the way that I think about it is each one of these is its own database, because it is its own Dataverse database. Or another way to think about it is each one's its own SharePoint site collection, right? So this is going to be a boundary for all the things like security, who can do what here, the different tables, the different apps, like all of that is kind of bound into these different environments. And so while a lot of times you have access to the default environment, because that's kind of the willy-nilly anyone can do things, a lot of times, especially when you're getting started with this, you first want to jump in and go to another environment. So for example, I have one down here at the bottom called Shane Young's environment. This is my developer environment that was set up so just for me. It's kind of a bubble that I can build in, but because it's a different environment, it has its own Dataverse tables. So when I'm messing with things, I'm changing accounts or contacts from those default tables, I'm not changing the ones that everyone else is using. I'm in my own little bubble, right? So that's one of the things about Dataverse you want to understand is, environments are more complicated than that. There's a lot more there. But at a high level, when you understand Dataverse, just think of each environment as its own database or SharePoint site collection. And so going to different ones, you're going to see different tables like you'd see different lists. So we're in my environment. Now, also, depending on where we're at in time, right, at the top, you might see this thing called try the new data experience. I'm going to turn that off today. When it becomes the default experience, maybe we'll make another version of this video with that experience. That one has a lot cooler stuff. It's better. It can do more things. It integrates Copilot in the mix. It can do relationships and all this other stuff. The challenge, though, is that it kind of obscures some of it. By helping you, it kind of changes some of the underlying learning. So what we're going to do is we're going to do it without the new experience so we can go understand under the hood how it works. So if you turn that on, you'd be like, oh, I know what that did. I know what this is because I've learned it at lower level, right? So that's our plan. So we're going to turn this off. And so what we're looking for over here on the left is tables. Now, if you go to an environment and you don't see tables, this is because when the environment was created, it was created without a Dataverse database. And so if that's the case, then you'll want to switch to a different environment or talk to an administrator, someone who knows more about your Power Platform, and get them to give you a Dataverse environment or an environment that does have the Dataverse tables enabled. I'm assuming you got this. So we'll go here to tables. So when you drop into here, you're going to see a lot of different stuff. And so these tables here, there's a lot of these that come with it. Like if you think about when you create a SharePoint site collection, there might be 2 or 3 lists that are already there. In Dataverse, there's like 30 or 40, right? Probably more than that. All these tables that kind of are part of the underlying system functionality, right? So those are called standard tables. But typically what you're coming in here for, especially right now, is to create a new custom table. So I'm going to create a new custom list in SharePoint. So to do that, what we're going to do is we're going to go up here and we're going to click on New Table. And so we have different options here. Add columns and data. That's what we're going to do because that's the manual understand all the pieces process. If you have Copilot enabled in your environment and your tenant, right? Like some of my government cloud people are still waiting on it to show up, for example. Here you can say describe the table. So this is where you use words to create it. We're not going to do that today. We got some advanced properties. We can pull other data in. Right? There's different things that we can do here, but really we just want to create ourselves a simple custom table. So we're going to say add columns and data. After a few seconds, it's going to load up this lovely little interface where you build out your table. Now, it's important to understand that at this point, my table doesn't exist. So as we're going to go through this task right now, it's not building anything. It's not until we hit the create down there in the bottom right that it's actually going to create it. So that way, if you kind of get through it, you start designing, you're like, I hate what I've done here. You can just hit delete and it goes away. Whereas SharePoint, right, you have to create the list and then you add the columns. Here we get to do all the columns, kind of get everything situated, be like, yes, that's what I want. And then you hit create. Little difference, doesn't super matter. So here it says new table. This is the table name, right? So we can say edit table properties, and we're going to change the name up here to do something like getting started with Dataverse employees. So this is where I'm going to rebuild my employees list, but I'm putting that there so I'll know what it is later. So the plural name, this is one that like you'll see PowerApps reference in different places. So make sure the plural name like makes sense for you. Sometimes like the weird things it does with like double plurals and stuff, it can be a little weird, but you might see this name show up. In this case, because it was already plural, it's using the same one. Like I said, a little weird, just be cognizant of that. For the description here, this is the ability to have a description on your table, just like you do your SharePoint list. I don't ever set one of those. And then if we do advanced options, you're going to see this schema name. All right, so you're going to see something different for the CR52A. That's the prefix from my publisher, right? Like it doesn't matter. And so then here, this is the underscore, like the system name. So you could change this if you want. You're probably not going to, but if you think about like SharePoint, right? Sometimes we like the underlying root name, if you ever had to go like against the API and stuff, can matter. So if you're worried about that, you could mess with it, but most likely you're not. Also, primary column is grayed out. That's fine. So if we say save, right, there's our lovely little name there. And so the primary column, this is the one that is sitting here. If you think about this in terms of SharePoint, this is the title column. So like if we do a lookup, some type of relationship against this table later, this is the column that's going to pull through. So you want it to be that primary thing you'd want to reference it by. And just to make it feel more like SharePoint, we're going to say edit column. And we're going to change its name to title. We're going to say title. We're going to leave it single line of text format. We're going to go over all this stuff in another minute. The only thing you might want to note here, if you go to advanced options, there's that schema name again. Once again, you're probably not changing these, but these are the things that like SharePoint just did for us, so we can kind of see those. So we're going to say update. So there, we've got a title column just like we would in a SharePoint list. So now I want to create a column so we can kind of get into the details, right? So we're going to say new column. And so when we do new column here, we're going to use first name, right? Because I want to kind of build up my employee list. So the first name is my display name. Data type. So Dataverse has a lot of different data types, and they are similar to your SharePoint data types with some nuances, right? So we're going to make sure we kind of hit as many of those nuances as we can. So obviously for first name, we want it to be text. Now I could just hit text and it would be chosen. Or I could have done text and hit the little flyout arrow here, and there's different text options over here. So notice it's like, well, okay, for a single line of text, I can do plain text, text area, email, phone number, tickets, ticker symbol, and URL. And then multi-lines, I can do plain text. Yeah, right? These are really kind of setting the format of it, right? So the data structure, like storing text, characters, is going to be the same no matter which one of those you choose, whether between single line and multi-line, but the different style. So for example, if you choose email and then you go and use this with a PowerApps Canvas app, it's going to do nothing. Like it's just going to be text. But if you take that same column and expose it in a model-driven app, then in that model-driven app, it's going to be, oh, that's an email field, and it's automatically going to be hooked up to, enable mailing those people, right? So it'll understand the format and it'll add some different niceties on the UI of model-driven apps. So really all of these are kind of for changing that. In reality, right now I'm just thinking about storing a first name. Plain text is going to work just great for me. Now, so we'll do first name here, plain text, right? There's the format, so there's where we could choose those separately, but it's set for us, whether or not it's required. And then under advanced options, we've got that same schema thing. So that's pretty straightforward there. We'll say save. Now let's add a note field, right? So we're gonna say plus, we're gonna do note. Now this time I'm going to choose multi-line of text. And only that option there is plain text. So the reason that I wanted to do multi-line of text, the default for single line of text we just did is 100 characters. Now it can go from anywhere from 100 to 4,000. For multi-lines of text, its default, I believe, is 1,000. We'll double check that in a second, but it can go up to 1 million characters, right? So you would want to change that based on the amount of data you're going to store, right? We don't want to set it always to 1 million. If you're only going to do 500 characters, set it to 500, right? But, set it appropriately, but know that you have to change it. And note those numbers are different, right? Like SharePoint single line text is 255 characters. So if you want to be exactly the same as SharePoint, you're going to need to manually change that, which we can't do from this interface. We'll have to do in a minute. Or if you're doing multi-line SharePoint, I think it caps out at 65,000-ish. So we'll save that one. Now, how about let's capture these people's age, right? So we'll do a plus here and we'll do age. Now this time we're going to look at number. So number has some of the same craziness. I could just choose number and this would just be integers, right? Whole numbers. But if you hit the little flyout here, we've got whole numbers, right? So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We got decimals and floats, right? Which are 1.25, 3.99, right? Like the different types of those. And honestly, like, there's a difference between decimal and float. I have read about it about 100 times and it still doesn't make sense in my head. Like, one of them has more precision than the other. One's more important. And I don't know. Like, if your number, like if you're just thinking like currency, two points, just use a decimal. But if you're like thinking, all right, I need to do scientific calculations with 100 points out there, you should understand the difference between float and decimal. Me, I don't have to. Language code, I've never used this one, duration or time zone, but those are just different number style formats, right? Which once again is going to change the behavior over in model-driven apps. So for the most part, you really just kind of, hopefully most of the time, choosing between whole number or decimal. And so for age, we just want a whole number. So we're going to click that. And then there's no format, is it required? And then there's nothing fancy under advanced options. Okay, so pretty straightforward with numbers. So we'll say save. All right, now let's talk about a super confusing one. We're going to do date. All right, so we go here, we're going to make a column. We're going to call it higher date. And then in our drop down here, we're going to choose date and time. And we're going to hit our flyout again. And so you have date and time and date only. All right. So these formats really, really matter a lot more than you expect, right? So date and time obviously is going to be this idea that I just, I want to store a date and time, have that available. And then date only is this thought that I only want to store dates, but what we're going to look at in a minute is that date only actually stores the date with a timestamp of midnight, right? 000, which can come into play with time zones. So we're going to need to look at this one further, but what we're going to choose is we're going to say date only here. So we're going to say date only, and then we are going to not make it required. We're looking at advanced options, so we'll say save. All right, 2 more to go. We're almost there. So next up, we're going to do favorite color. So I'm going to hit plus. We're going to say favorite color. And for this one, what we want to do is we want to do a choice column. Now, a choice column, right, just like we have in SharePoint, is going to let us choose the options that are available, right? So for our favorite colors, we just go here, we type in red, new choice, blue, new choice, green. Okay, so this value, like just ignore this. This is an underlying system ID column, like we don't really care. Also here, you can change the color. So if I really wanted the red one to be red, like you can do this. I have never found a place that those actually really show up. If we're being honest, I don't set those in, real world scenarios. So we're going to set them now. Maybe we'll trip over some place they show up, but they've never really had a point as far as I can tell, especially building like PowerApps, Canvas apps. It doesn't even pull through the color. It just pulls through the word red, blue, green. We can select multi-choices as allowed. So just the same way we can in SharePoint, remembering that this changes the data structure from a record into a table. So it makes it even more complicated to sort, filter, patch, all those things. But we can change that, right? The same kind of chaos that SharePoint has there. And then of course we could set a default choice, and advanced options is just the name, right? So, and I keep pointing advanced options here. There's a bunch more advanced options for all these column types, but this interface doesn't show you. So in a minute, when we switch over, we're going to look at those more advanced options. I kind of find it annoying that those advanced options just don't show through here. Okay, so we got our favorite color. We're going to say save. And last but not least, we're going to do good at their job. And for this one, we're going to do a choice. And this time we're going to do yes, no. This is super confusing, okay? Because in SharePoint, yes, no is a Boolean column, right? It actually returns true or false under the hood if you've ever looked at it, kind of one level deeper. Dataverse, they, for whatever crazy reason, decided to make it a choice column as well that just has 2 choices. It is not something you can just act on true or false. It is literally just a choice of yes and no. Boo. I don't approve that they did it this way. They didn't ask me, so I didn't get to say. But keep that in mind. This one, yes, no is drastically different than its SharePoint counterpart because of that little nuance, right? But we'll go ahead and set that up. So we'll say save. And so we've got all of that sitting there, right? We look like we're in good shape. You could go ahead and throw in some fake data if you wanted. So let's fill that out real quick. Okay, so I edited it out, right? But I just filled in the data here, walking through this interface, right? I just filled in all the fields, right? You just click in there and you type. The reason I always do this is you want to be sure that when you pull it into your Power App or into the Excel database, we're going to pull in a second, that there's something there. So you can be like, yes, my data showed up. I know I did what I think I did. So with all that done, now let's go ahead and say create. Hey, are you enjoying this practical learning style that I love to do? I hope you are. Then keep in mind, I've got a bunch of training classes over at trainingpoweraapps911.com. I've got on-demand classes. I've got a bunch of live classes. We just released a whole schedule of new ones of those, so go check those out. We've even got a 6-month university program that we run our actual consultants through to make you a superstar across the Power Platform. So if that sounds like fun, go to training.poweraapps911.com. back to the video. And after like 20 seconds, it drops us in this interface. Okay, so this is looking at that table more specifically. Now, what I want you to understand though, is if you go back over here, remember we clicked on tables to start. So now in this list would be our table. So if I scroll down here, getting started with Dataverse Employees. So you can get here, right, both ways. I want to make sure we connect that dot, right? Because that's how your table could come in. So I could continue to add some data in here manually. We're not going to do that. But what I really want to do now is I want to switch back to this columns view. So now if we click on columns, right now that we're kind of out of that nice interface, here are all the columns. Notice that, not only is there like age that we created our favorite color, but there's created by delegate, created on, there's import sequence numbers and UTC stuff and version numbers. There's a bunch of different system columns. So even though we only created about 6 or 7, there's like 20 here. So that's kind of part of the fun, I guess. Also, speaking of these columns, so there's a lot I want to speak about here. One of them is super confusing. So in SharePoint now we have the ID column, right? It starts at 1 and goes 2, 3, 4, 5, and that's our primary key. How we reference everything. In Dataverse, they don't have an ID column. Boo. What they do, because they like to torture us, I think, is they name it the same thing as a table. So my table is getting started with Dataverse Employees. So there's a column called getting started with Dataverse Employees, and it is the unique identifier. So this is the primary key. This is your ID, but instead of it starting at 1 and going sequential like SharePoint does, they use a GUID, right? That 26 character alphanumeric thing, and that is your primary key. So that is totally different than SharePoint. So I just want to make sure I call it out because there's a lot of people have a hard time figuring out what this is, why there's a duplicate thing here, and more importantly, where's their ID? So, okay. I also want to kind of go and look at some of these a little bit differently. Right? So if we go here, or you know what, let's just do this. So let's create a new column. So we'll go up here, we'll click on new column. And so let's do last name, right? We didn't do last name when we went through, right? So there's last name. Now, you notice same thing, right? Single line text, the format. You're going to see different things around like behavior, right? So if you want to make calculated columns, we're not going to get into those today, but those are possible. The different required. But what I'm really after here, now if we do advanced options, here you're going to see, yes, that same schema name that we worried about. But look, there's that max character. Remember, I told you that it defaults to 100. So if I wanted to be like SharePoint, I would need to change this to 255. If I try to change it to 25,000, it's going to remind me it only goes up to 400. So we'll go to that 255. There's other things down here that, once again, we're not going to worry about right now, but there are more advanced things to learn about later on as you get more familiar. But right now, it's really just the character count. But now if we save, we're able to set that on the fly. So if we wanted to go update first name, we could also just click on first name. We'll get that same interface back. And then we just go to advanced options and there's that 100 again. And so 255 save for that one. So most of the settings for these columns can be changed. And a lot of times you'll want to change them because, like I said, if you're used to SharePoint, 255 characters, this 100 limit is quite a bit different. Looking back at the new column interface, it's all the same stuff here. There is a file data type, right? So we could get into that. There's these new things called formula columns where you can write a PowerApps formula. We're not gonna get into those today. Autonumber. One weird thing to keep in mind with Autonumber is not a number column. It is a text column. And so you can set it up, right? And so you can have it replicate your ID column you're used to with SharePoint, where it would just start at 1 and count its way up. But that would be the text one, not the number one, which can cause confusion in some of your automations and stuff. Just remember, Autonumber is a text column. Currency, this is a decimal, right? So a currency column. But when you turn this one on in Dataverse, it adds a bunch of additional complexity around the type of currency. You can have exchange rates. It adds 4 columns when you add this one. And there's a lot of really cool functionality there, but it's a lot to unpack when you're started. So just keep that in mind. If you're ever like, man, I want to have a currency column in here and I want to handle both things in, pesos and dollars and francs and rubles and you name the different currencies. I'm running out of pounds, euros, liras, I don't know, whatever those are. There's an infrastructure in Dataverse to handle that. We're not going to cover it today, but it is all there. Also, the last one we're not going to cover today is lookups. And so lookups are the ability to build relationships, right? So the same way that SharePoint has lookup columns, Dataverse has lookup columns, and Dataverse relationships work similar, but they're actually even better because you can do this thing called dot notate your way through. That's called a polymorphic lookup. Right? There's a lot of cool stuff to learn about there, but we're not going to dive into that one because it's too complicated for today also. Okay, so let's cancel out of this. The other thing I want to talk about before we leave here is the hire date. So remember we talked about with hire date that we set it to date only, but I told you it's really the date and then midnight. That gets a lot of people in trouble because they set something as date only, and they set it for what is today, September 5th. And if I'm in the Eastern time zone, that would set it as December 5th at 000, right? What happens if someone opens it in California, where the Pacific time, they're 3 hours behind us? The time zone settings will automatically set in, and it'll be, oh, we need to take that 9/5 at 000 and subtract 3 hours, which becomes 9/4 at 2100, right? Uh-oh, now the date looks like it's off a date. So if you ever have problems with dates being off a day, it's time zones that are getting you almost always. And so one of the things you can do here with a date only column, go here to advanced options, is you can actually set the time zone adjustments, right? So this is where it will determine how it behaves. Now you can't change it after the fact, boo. But if we create a new one, so new, and we choose date here, and so we change the format to date only and go to advanced options, we can change this and we can actually say date only. So if you choose date only here, then it is truly date only. Yay! Which means that, it doesn't carry the 000, it just carries 9/5/2024. So no matter what time zone you open it in, it's not going to update itself. This is a very common challenge that people run into. I literally helped someone on Reddit with this yesterday. So just be cognizant of the whole date only, the time zone adjustments that can happen to the user local or the time zone independent, which time zone independent should work, but so many people end up with it in user local and they can't figure out why it keeps, being off by a day. It's really just off by the time zone switch. So let's cancel out of here. A couple more things real quick. Another one that I think is really important if you're trying to learn to understand this thing today is, if you go over here to edit and hit the drop down and say edit data in Excel. Let's click on that. This will download an Excel file. And if I open that file, and then it's going to do a add-in for the Microsoft PowerApps. And so the first time you get it, you might have to log in. It didn't make me log in, so I couldn't show you what that looks like, but you would just authenticate with your same stuff. And so then now it's got a direct connection. So it's not a copy of my data, it's a live connection, right? So if I go up here and make another one of these, like Napper, and we'll just set the first name to Buddy. Now, if I go to good at his job, notice I can get a little interface over here. So you good at his job? No, he's not. But we get an interface for kind of working with all this stuff, right? So that's kind of nice. But what's great now is then down here at the bottom, if you say publish, it's going to take all my data and it's going to push it back to Dataverse. So if we switch over to Dataverse real quick and we go back here and we just refresh this page, my new record is pushed in. Woohoo! Right? So the reason I point this out, one is I've had projects where I needed to do a bunch of bulk editing and I just did all the bulk editing over here. Like that super helped me out. But two, if we rewind to like 6 or 7 years ago when I first had to learn Dataverse, it was actually called something, it was like 3 names ago when I had to first do it. Anyway, when I had to learn it, this was like my aha moments for Dataverse when I was able to come in here and see the raw data, right? Like, so I could figure out, for example, that, there was that GUID. Remember we talked about the primary key? There's that primary key. And created by, that's not the person. We know that it's created by me, but instead that's the GUID for me, right? And so by starting to understand that type of stuff, I could kind of connect the dots. So fabulous interface for kind of getting yourself in here and looking at it. Now, a lot of people never find this one, so I love to share this all. Okay, so now that we have built a table, we can do whatever we want with it. So we could go edit it with Excel. We could go back over here to create, or actually let's go back over here to home. And so we could say start with data, and then we could say start with an existing table, right? So click on this. And then now if we found our lovely little thing, getting started with Dataverse employees, select it and say create app. And so this is going to build us a fully functional Power App with a gallery to look at the data and then a form to edit, create, have it delete. Like it's going to build this whole solution for us to interact with that data. So boom, like after 30 seconds, there is a fully working app, right? So we can play, we can use it, do all the fun things. So there you go, my friends. There's the kind of first getting started with Dataverse. There's so much more to learn. Like, I don't even know if it's possible to learn everything there is to know about Dataverse. It is so complex. There's so many cool, powerful things it can do. So we're not trying to learn all that, but hopefully now you at least understand it. Also, if you're thinking like, well, why would I even care about this? Remember that Dataverse is the fastest, best, most robust, most feature-rich data source for building Power Apps. Also, if you go back over to, make here and we go to create and like if we do blank app, so Canvas apps, which we probably all know and love, right? They can be built on SharePoint, Dataverse, SQL, Excel, like anything you can think of, you can build a Canvas app on. But these model-driven apps or Power Pages, both of those only really work with Dataverse, right? So Dataverse is the foundation of the platform. It's also the only thing that works with these two tools. Keeping in mind though, that with Dataverse, if you build a Canvas app or any of these solutions on top of that, then you're going to need additional licensing. So if you've always built PowerApps on top of SharePoint, and the whole reason you're here is because you're, hey, I want more performance, more scale, more greatness, which I hope you do, then remember that your SharePoint apps were all built using the license that was included with your Office 365 subscription, most likely. That license does not cover building an app with Dataverse or SQL or any of the other premium data sources. So your licensing story will change, and it's about licensing the people that use your app. I can build an app on Dataverse without a premium license, but when I go to share it with my people, in order for them to use it, they need a license. So that's an important nuance here to keep in mind with Dataverse. It's the best, but it does change your licensing story. And yes, even if you have an E5 license, E5 does not include premium Dataverse licensing. It doesn't. I don't know. I always get that question, so I'll just save that for the comments. So speaking of comments, if you have any, leave them below. I'm always happy to answer those. What videos do you want to see next? I've got tons of Dataverse videos already out there, but I'm always happy to remake these. Like I said, when the new interface comes out, it's not an optional turn on or off. We'll remake this type of video with that as well. And I guess with that, I'm just going to say thanks and have a great day.